37.
Oh, God.
Is somebody trying to tell me something?
In Harmon, Northern California, a down-to-earth auto mechanic named George Malley lives happily in a small rural community where everyone knows each other by name, with his dog Attila, and revels in the steady peace of his surroundings. In town, George owns an auto shop called Malley's Auto Service, which the locals rely on, bringing in their worn-out vehicles and entrusting them to the trustworthy George and his employees, a young mechanic named Baines, and an old Spanish man named Tito. On the morning of his 37th birthday, George wakes up early, greets Attila, and, hoping this time that Attila might have dealt with the stubborn rabbit that keeps slipping past his carefully and personally built garden fence, he excitedly steps outside, prematurely celebrating the feat. However, once in the garden, George is annoyed to see the rabbit calmly chewing on his cherished lettuce leaves and disappointed by the dog's poor guarding skills, playfully scolds Attila. Moments later, before George can find a solution to his gardening problems, he is distracted by the sound of a truck approaching his house, and, realizing that it's his best friend Nate, goes down to greet him. As soon as Nate reaches the house, he jumps out of his truck and, despite knowing that George is not looking to do any more renovations on his house, excitedly announces that he has gotten an incredible deal on solar panels, has bought some for George, and asks him for a hand to get them off the truck. Amused by his friend's effort, George does as asked while picking Nate's brains.
But I see you improved the garden anyway.
And that goddamn rabbit still got in there.
Then, once finished with the task, Nate takes the time out to sincerely wish his best friend a happy birthday before preparing to leave.
Who's gonna put it together, huh?
Not me.
Then, Nate and George discuss George's birthday party, planned for that evening at a local bar. And after settling on the details, with obvious doubt in his tone, George hints that he's thinking of asking his longtime crush, Lace, to accompany him, for which Nate scolds him for waiting until the last minute to do so. Then, after agreeing to see each other at the party, Nate once again extends his warmest wishes to George and speeds away. A few minutes later, George prepares and heads into work. There, while George and Baines work on a vehicle, Tito comes in and starts giving George a message. Curious to learn new things, George hurries to use his Spanish-English dictionary, as always, to understand what the old man is trying to tell him before Baines volunteers to translate. However, despite George's best and rushed efforts, Baines impatiently jumps in, translates, and informs his boss that his very close friend and father figure, Doc Brunder, who works across the street from the shop, has asked the birthday man to look up at his window in a few minutes, but is soon interrupted by the arrival of Lace, whom he allows to sell her handmade chairs at his shop. George drops everything and rushes to greet Lace, compliments her, and after excitedly informing her that chairs have sold out, he helps her unload some more from her truck.
Hey, Lace, there's a party tonight at the Elkhorn Bar. So, hey, you think you could come to the party?
No, I don't like to leave my...
Then, George is redirected to Doc Brunder's office window, from which the doctor displays a grand happy birthday sign, and, to the shock of Lace and the entertainment of the men, playfully moons him. Moments later, as Lace proceeds to leave, George runs after her and politely asks her to reconsider her position and re-invites her to the party, but fails to convince her. However, instead of feeling discouraged, with a smile on his face, George sincerely tells her that he will keep asking her and helps her into her truck. Then, noticing Lace having difficulty starting her car, George volunteers his services to fix it, but is disappointed when she just acknowledges his offer and speeds off. That evening, a giant sign announcing George's birthday is posted at the bar along with his picture, and the locals gather to celebrate one of their own. Soon, George arrives, is quite touched by the turnout, and starts to enjoy himself, grateful to have spent another year among his loved ones, who have gone the extra mile to make him feel special. A few minutes into the party, Doc Brunder arrives with a gift.
Oh, Doc, thank you.
Hey, Jimmy!
Well,
Then, George playfully scolds Doc Brunder for embarrassing him in front of his crush earlier that day, and the group of men breaks out in laughter, reliving the hilarious moment. Then, as the discussion turns to Lace, Baines reveals how uncomfortable her handmade chairs are until George comes to her rescue and defends her honor, and even goes out on a limb to criticize the way Baines sits in a chair. How many ways are there to sit in a chair, George? Later, the bartender, Jimmy, provides the men with a free round of drinks in honor of George's birthday, adding to the merriment of the occasion.
You have potential, George. I always said George Malley has something extra to offer this world.
Then, there on the quiet, still road, George takes a moment to raise his glass to the clear sky, grateful to life, and takes a minute to work on his dreams for the coming year. However, seconds later, before he can figure it out, the utter stillness is unexpectedly shattered by a bright ball of light that appears out of the dark sky and hits him. George falls to the ground and is knocked out for a few minutes. However, when he wakes up only moments later, he's confused to see that nothing is amiss and everything is as quiet as it can be. Confused out of his mind and hoping to find some kind of clue to what had just transpired, George rushes back to the bar.
Kind of like.
There was a noise. Did you hear it?
Oh.
Then, as George starts to doubt himself and what he has just experienced, Doc Brunder snaps him out of his self-reflection, sets up the checkers board, and asks him to focus and play around. But to everyone's shock, despite having never played the game, George beats his experienced opponent in just a couple of moves and stuns him. Utterly flabbergasted by the outcome, Nate surmises that the doctor must have gifted George the win as a late birthday present and tries to justify the event. Then, after spending a couple more hours, an exhausted George promises Doc a rematch for the next day and proceeds to leave.
Thanks, everybody.
Happy birthday, buddy.
Happy birthday, George.
George heads home, excited to retire to bed. But after getting there, sleep evades him completely. Hence, George spends hours reading, gets an unexpected epiphany, and calls Nate in the wee hours of the night.
I figured it out. There's only one explanation of that rabbit. See, he was hiding. I fenced him in.
Then, with the vibrant energy of a bright morning, George walks out of the house, brimming with excitement, slowly opens both doors of his garden's fence, sits on his deck, and patiently waits. Then, just as he predicted, the stubborn rabbit quickly walks out while George laughs to himself, celebrating his feat. The next day, at the auto shop, a local man named Roger comes in with a request, and George stuns everyone. Before Baines and Tito process the incredible efficiency, another customer comes to request a service, and to the utter bewilderment of the duo, George gives orders to Tito in fluent Spanish.
Tito, you speak Spanish better than I do now.
Yeah, better than me too.
Then George slides under a car to work on it, and as he tries to grab a wrench that's out of reach, unbeknownst to him, the wrench is pulled towards him through telekinesis, and he quickly continues to work. Then, George steps outside to find Lace's truck parked in front of the store nearby, approaches it, and meets her young kids, Al and Glory. After chatting with the cheerful kids for a bit, George tries to use the opportunity to fix Lace's truck and quickly opens the hood until Lace returns from the store and interrupts him.
I didn't say what I saw.
What did it look like?
What could have been?
Then, George goes to the bar to play chess with Doc.
That's mate, Doc.
Wait, George. What in the hell is going on?
The locals then try to understand what George is explaining, and taking his word about what he had experienced, they wonder if it's at all related to the sighting. George then dismisses Doc's offer to give him a physical examination at his clinic to make sure he's doing all right, and proceeds to head back to work, until a genuinely mystified Roger runs after him and asks him about the numerous books he reads.
About everything. You know, all the things I've wanted to know about and learn.
Over the next few months, George spends most of his time buried deep into books, studying different disciplines and entertaining himself with loads of new knowledge. Then, after doing his own deep research to understand the solar panel system, George redesigns them to make them more efficient. He then momentarily changes his topic of research to focus on fertilizers, produces a potent one, and uses it on his garden, which soon flourishes. He also comes up with better techniques for Nate's pig farming practice and sets it up for his best friend. Despite achieving such major breakthroughs, George can't quite quench his thirst for new knowledge. One evening, George decides to give a couple of Lace's amateurly crafted chairs to his best friend and heads over to Nate's house to present them to him. There, despite failing to convince Nate to love the uncomfortable chairs, which only he appreciates and buys, he takes them inside and leaves them there.
Looks like a swap meet blew in here. Talk about needing a woman's touch.
Then, once George takes a breath, he realizes that Nate is scanning for shortwave frequencies, which is his hobby, recognizes a Morse code pattern, and ignoring Nate's warning that it may be from the Air Force base nearby and hence it's best to leave it alone, George opts to record it and take it home with him to try to decode so that he will have something to do when he returns home, and explains that he no longer knows how to spend the dark hours of the night in which the world goes to sleep, as doing puzzles and reading books has become too simple for him.
Hey, why don't we just go outside and box? I can split you up again.
Ah, the brotherhood. Then, accepting George's request, Nate sends a response signal, and after the duo hangs out for a bit, George returns home. There, he spends the next few hours reading a book, but soon inadvertently notices his telekinesis ability and freaks out.
Is somebody trying to tell me something? What?
The next morning, George heads to Doc's office for a checkup, and after sharing that he's still having trouble sleeping, he shyly demonstrates his telekinesis abilities, which blows away the old man, who turns into a boy filled with curiosity and wonder, and watches George's fascinating ability over and over again. Then, after a few minutes of excitement, the doc resumes his professional demeanor and promises to get to the bottom of whatever is going on and comforts his friend. One afternoon at the auto shop, as George demonstrates his latest discovery to Tito, with whom he can now communicate without any help, Lace comes in with more of her handmade chairs, which, unbeknownst to her, only George buys and, excited that most have been sold, puts them on display. Like always, George drops everything to assist Lace, proudly shows her the new batch of tasty tomatoes he has just grown using his potent fertilizer, and asks her to take them home to the kids. However, hoping to maintain her distance and keep him at an arm's length, like she always does, Lace politely feigns being in a rush and speeds away, after congratulating the mechanic on his achievements. Instead of being discouraged, George loads the basket of tomatoes onto his truck a few minutes later and sets out to drive the long distance to Lace's house, desperately hoping he can finally win her over and convince her to give him a chance. After traveling a few miles, George spots Al and Glory playing in a field from afar and decides to give them a ride. As he continues on with his lengthy journey, George picks wildflowers from the surrounding fields, makes them into a small bouquet with Glory's help, and speeds to the house while playfully getting to know the children. Once at the house, George follows the children's lead and excitedly heads to the backyard, where he finds Lace washing clothes, and, after handing her the bouquet and describing how much fun the children are, finally tells her how much he would like the chance to get to know her better. However, before Lace can answer this all-important question, George picks up on subtle environmental cues, frantically asks to borrow Lace's phone, and makes a call.
Look, I'm just trying to tell you that I felt the compression waves, okay? There's an earthquake coming.
Then, following Lace's invitation to stay for dinner, George joins the family as they gather around the table and genuinely appreciates Lace's cooking as he eats dinner with them. Delighted to have his company, the kids joke around and have fun with George and spend time with him. After a couple of hours, George prepares to start his long journey home. Lace walks him out and politely bids him farewell. However, moments later, as Lace starts cleaning up, just like George had predicted, a small earthquake shakes the town and scares the single mother, who loads her kids onto her truck and speeds to George's house, demanding to know what's going on. There, Lace finds a calm George, who reveals that he doesn't know the source of his knowledge. However, before the duo can get to the bottom of this, Lace notices a number of her handmade chairs on George's porch, goes to inspect them closely, finds a room full of them, and fumes.
I just asked you for one thing, George. The truth. And you couldn't handle it.
He was just trying to help Lace. A few days later, after decoding the Morse code, George goes to Nate's house to ask him to send back a message, and as the duo hangs out, Nate tries to convince George to call Lace and apologize, but fails. Then, to the utter shock of Nate, George shows him his telekinetic abilities, and the duo starts wondering about the origins of such powers, but fails to find an answer. A few days later, Doc Brunder is summoned to a sick Portuguese man's house by the locals, who inform him that the man is new in the small town, and ever since he has fallen ill, no one has seen the young boy who had arrived with him. Then, despite the patient's best effort to explain his symptoms and the story to the doctor who starts examining him, the language barrier makes it difficult and forces Doc to order the locals to find George and ask him to come to the location with a Portuguese-English dictionary as soon as possible. Meanwhile, at his house, George hangs out with Nate, who's impressed by the impressive, flourishing garden in his friend's front yard and applauds his success. Then, as George continues proudly tending to his garden, a seismologist named Dr. John Ringgold arrives and asks to speak to him.
We are very interested in how you were able to predict that earthquake, Mr. Malley.
Then, George proudly shows Dr. John his recent projects.
Mr. Malley?
I took incandescent light
Mr. Malley, all I'm interested in is the earthquake. We need to know if that was a fluke.
Then, despite being impressed by the numerous discoveries, the doctor tries to remain focused, and as he explains that George's skill needs to be replicated in a controlled environment and proven, a frantic Tito arrives to alert George of the emergency on the other side of town and drives him there. Curious to find out what's going on, the doctor tags along as Tito speeds to the location, while George sits in the car quietly studying the Portuguese-English dictionary. After a 20-minute drive, the trio arrives at the location, and Doc Brunder tells George to speak to the patient. Then, to the bewilderment of everyone, George speaks to the man in fluent Portuguese and learns that both he and the young boy Alberto had eaten some food that had gone bad and got sick, but that now Alberto is missing. Following George's directions, the locals head to the nearby woods to look for Alberto, and after a few minutes of futile searching, George starts to feel the boy's pain in his body, and following his heightened senses leads the men to a treehouse. However, the pain becomes too much to bear, and George falls to his knees before he can reach it. And, desperate to help Alberto, to the horror of everyone, George uses his telekinetic abilities to remove the pile of logs covering the ladder to the treehouse and advises the men to look for the young boy there. Tito quickly climbs up, finds the young boy whimpering in pain, alerts everyone, and soon the boy is rescued and taken to the hospital. In the aftermath, the once doubtful Dr. Jon, who had required George to prove his skills to be taken seriously, approaches him.
And I'll have somebody from Solar Energy there, and anything else?
Then, as George proceeds to head back, he realizes that the locals have still not recovered from the events that took place in the woods and are all still quietly staring at him with sheer bewilderment. Then, as a concerned George tries to push this out of his mind, Albert's mother, who had been out all day looking for work, returns home and, after learning of everything that had transpired in her absence, profusely thanks George, who comforts her. That evening, having been informed that Ella is a housekeeper, George visits Nate, whose loneliness has always worried him, and, hoping to set him up with Ella, convinces him to hire her as a housekeeper. Then, despite Ella's ability to communicate in English, George volunteers to teach Nate Portuguese in the name of better communication, and using a tape recorder, tricks his best friends into learning compliments and flirtations in Portuguese. On the other side of town, at Lace's house, Al and Glory excitedly narrate George's feat from earlier in the day and share how much they like him, and nag their mother to give him a chance.
Yeah, there's been a lot of UFO people coming into town since George saw what he saw.
Rocked by the recent events, the small town continues discussing George and his supernatural abilities for the next few weeks. One afternoon, George heads to the bar for a drink, but as soon as he sits down, the locals surround him and start badgering him to find out how he came to know so many things in such a short time, and even boldly ask him if he's haunted by spirits who inform him of the secrets of the world. Despite being annoyed, George takes the matter lightly, makes a few funny jokes, and tries to ease their concern. However, without getting the hint of his frustration, the locals continue pressing on and testing his limits. Hoping to keep the peace, George ignores the endless questions and walks out of the bar. Then, once outside, George sees Lace across the street, summons his courage to approach her, and, after sincerely apologizing to her for lying about her chairs, asks her to join him on his trip to Berkeley.
I guess I'm scared, too.
What for?
Support?
I'll be outside your shop at noon if I'm coming.
Meanwhile, Ella arrives at Nate's house to introduce herself and work out the details of her employment. However, at the sight of the beautiful young woman, the normally confident Nate struggles to speak and tries hard to maintain his composure while quietly thanking George for everything. Then, as Ella proceeds to leave the house, promising to return and start working the next morning, hoping to impress her, Nate speaks to her in the Portuguese phrases he had learned and inadvertently flirts with her. Elsewhere, George returns home and is confused to find his house swarming with FBI agents. Curious to find out what's going on, George heads inside and meets with the lead agent, Jack Hatch.
Well, who taught you the cipher, Mr. Malley? Who trained you?
As I said, nobody.
Later, while a terrified Nate sits in a cell wondering how he can possibly get out of his predicament, George is taken into an interrogation room filled with agents and asked to decode numerous signals. After giving it a few half-hearted attempts, George explains that the task is too complex, turns it down, and instead asks to speak to his best friend, who's being released from custody.
It caused the cancellation of a top-secret training exercise, Mr. Malley, the scrapping of an entire cipher system.
Then, annoyed that they are getting nowhere with George, the head of the FBI concocts a plan to keep holding George without charging him.
Can't keep holding him.
Yes, we can. He resisted arrest.
Hence, George is kept in custody to be tested by Dr. Neerdorf and stuns him.
If a man is born in 1928 and he's still alive, how old is he?
He's 67 years, 9 months, 22 days, 14 hours, and
in 12 minutes.
As the doctor watches in disbelief, George casually answers a series of difficult questions. Then, to the utmost shock of Dr. Neerdoff, George sits back in his chair and starts moving a pencil through his telekinetic power.
Is that a trick pencil?
No, I asked it to move.
George is held overnight. In the morning, Jack approaches George, drops all the hostility he's been treated with, and asks him to join the world of intelligence and use his superior intellect to serve his country.
It's home for me, Jack. I'm jumping out of my skin here.
Feeling cornered to release the man they have found absolutely nothing to charge with, the FBI reaches out to Dr. Jon, and after detailing that George is considered a security risk, warns him from granting him any access to personnel or information. Elsewhere, in Harmon, George returns home that night and heads to Lace's house in the dead of night, and as if he were a teenager, knocks on her bedroom window. Lace rushes to speak to George and checks on him to make sure he's doing all right.
I should probably leave you alone, shouldn't I?
I guess so.
Your face says otherwise, Lace. Heartbroken, George heads to the bar to meet with a still shaken up Nate and profusely apologizes to him for causing him all the distress. Then, having heard the ordeal through the gossip grapevine, the locals ask George what the FBI did to him, which triggers him. Then, George goes on a rant explaining how difficult it is to be filled with a million ideas at any given moment, and goes around giving the local people ideas on how to improve their lives.
6 more cars in, and nobody gets fender benders, all right? Where's Paulette?
Then, George gets more heated, detailing that Dr. Jon has canceled his trip to Berkeley, and he inadvertently breaks a large bar window through telekinesis. Then, seeing the fear in the eyes of the locals, among whom he was born and bred, a disheartened George apologizes and flees the bar. Then, to make matters worse, Baines quits working at the auto shop a few days later, which further worsens George's horror. As word of the ordeal at the bar gets around, hoping to provide him with loving fatherly support, Doc Brunder visits George at the auto shop.
Well, look, I was mad, all right? I was pissed off, and I'm not mad now, okay? You won't give me a chance to explain anything. I look at them, and they...
Feeling isolated by the great phenomenon that had seemingly improved his life at the beginning, George feels stuck in his life, and even fails to enjoy the things he loves, like gardening. Suffocating in his new reality, George finds himself retreating to nature and spending hours staring at the tall trees surrounding his house just to calm his anxious nerves and find a moment of peace. Elsewhere, Lace learns from her kids that there is a viral conspiracy theory going around the school and town about George, and uses the opportunity to remind Al and Glory how hurtful it was when the town shunned them when their father left them, and teaches them a life lesson against bullying. Then, sensing the severity of George's predicament, Lace visits him at his house. As soon as he sees her, an excited George shares his decision to speak to the locals at the upcoming library fair to explain himself so that they would understand him better and stop fearing him, and asks her what she thinks of his decision. But before Lace can answer him, seeing his state and his disheveled look, Lace turns down the drink and instead offers to give him a haircut and a shave, which George happily accepts. Later, once finished with her task, seemingly terrified by the new unexpected intimacy, Lace flees the house after promising to return later. A few days later at the library fair, a stand holding the thousands of books read by George in the last 2 months is dedicated to George to hold a Q&A jack, and hundreds of locals gather around to hear from the now mysterious man himself, and soon the local press joins in. Then, Doc Brunder and Nate start things off with a couple of questions, which George answers with humor and breaks the ice. However, as the session goes on, despite George's best efforts to redirect questions and assumptions away from the ball of light he had seen on the night of his last birthday and share the knowledge he has learned in a simplified way, it all gets heated and out of hand.
The war began the night that you saw the object in the sky.
That was a light.
In just a few minutes, as George lies on the ground in broad daylight, he sees the same ball of light flying towards him out of the clear blue sky. The next thing he knows, George finds himself in a hospital room and looks out the window from his bed at the tall trees, whose graceful dance in the wind calms his racing mind. Then, to George's relief, Doc Brunder arrives. But before he can reunite with him gleefully, George notices the heartbroken look on his friend's face and wonders what's going on. Unable to utter the words, Doc stalls for minutes until Nate and Lace, whose faces are also swollen with tears, arrive. And Doc finally gives George the sad news.
George. There's a tumor in your brain.
Doc then approaches George and sits beside him on the hospital bed.
And for a man who's never been a father, I sure feel like I'm losing a son.
Unable to keep his tears at bay and maintain his composure, and hoping to give Lace and George some privacy, Nate invites Doc to step outside with him, and the duo leaves. Oh, the sheer heartbreak. George and Lace spend the next few days together at the hospital and cherish each moment they have together. Then, one afternoon, a world-renowned neurosurgeon named Dr. Wellen arrives and introduces himself to George.
I'm going to ask for your permission for my team to perform open brain surgery. You could be our greatest teacher, George.
To the outrage of Doc Brunder, Dr. Wellen goes to the court, testifies that his new surgical patient is not competent to make his own decision, overrides George's decision, and holds him at the hospital against his will. Drowning in the grief of a father who is losing his only son, Doc heads to the bar that evening and uncharacteristically tries to silence his pain through alcohol. However, after just a couple of drinks, Doc overhears Jimmy, Roger, and Baines, who were all once George's friends and whom George tried to help any chance he got, smearing the sick man's character, trying to come up with different theories on how they believe he had managed to trick everyone into believing in his intelligence for so long, and loses his mind in anger.
You have to tear him down. What are you so afraid of? What have you got to lose?
To hell with all of you. To hell with everyone.
Meanwhile, in his heavily guarded hospital room, knowing that he's doomed to be a science experiment, George uses his wit to formulate a plan. He then invites an orderly named Cal, whom he has befriended, casually offers him a pudding spiked with sedatives, and once he falls asleep, dons his uniform and slides right past the agent posted on his door and escapes. Nicely done. Later in Harmon, while Doc leaves the bar, he hears of this good news from a local cop who grumbles about being put on alert to drive around searching for George all night, waits until the coast is clear, and pokes a hole in the squad car's tire to sabotage the scheduled search party while laughing to himself. Meanwhile, George rushes to Nate's house, gives him research materials to give to Dr. John. He then gives him some letters he wrote for him, along with helpful documents on soil for his farm. But just before stepping out, George stops. Then the duo emotionally embraces, and George runs out of the house and heads to Lace's place. As George gets close to Lace's house, Attila, who is now living with Lace, senses his arrival from a mile away, jumps out happily and greets him. George then reunites with Lace and spends the night there. The next morning, with the help of the kids, George fixes Lace's car, just like he promised her he would. Then, as the trio has fun, Al hits him with a difficult question.
You came here to die, didn't you?
I like this place, and love the people here.
Still, after all they put you through, seeing how upset Al is, George subtly comforts him and teaches him the importance of treasuring each moment and continues to spend time with them. Later, Jack and his partner come looking for George at Lace's house, and as Jack starts looking around, Lace takes a chance to remind him of the gravity of George's predicament and asks him to let him die in peace. Touched by the sentiment, Jack does the honorable thing, calls away his partner, and leaves. Relieved, Lace then meets George by the field behind her house, working on some of his ideas, and the duo spends some quality time together. Later that night, while the kids slept, Lace faced the moment she had been dreading and was shattered.
No, wait. Wait, George.
It's okay. It's gonna be okay.
The next morning, Dr. John comes to the house to meet with John, is shocked by the news of his passing, and respectfully takes his research papers to continue working on George's breakthroughs. Lace and her children sit on the porch and cry their eyes out while holding on to each other for dear life. Then, they look at the tall trees by the side of the house and take comfort in their elegant movement in the wind, just like George used to do. A year later, now married to his pregnant wife, Ella, fluent in Portuguese and running a successful corn farm, Nate and Alberto run through the fields of corn to meet Ella by their truck and head into the bar, where all the locals and George's loved ones gather to celebrate what would have been George's birthday.